Hi, this is podcast number 20. In here, we're continuing our conversation about evolution and specifically about how to think about how organisms are related to each other evolutionarily in terms of trees and the origin of domains of life. In our roadmap here, we're right here where we're focusing on organisms and evolution. In Darwin's Origin of Species, there's one figure where he draws what's arguably one of the first phylogenetic trees. And a phylogenetic tree is a diagram that describes a hypothesis about how organisms are related to each other evolutionarily. So the idea is that Darwin proposed that there was an original ancestor organism, like the first cell, and then they split by the process of selection, drift, gene flow, mutation. He didn't know about any of those except for selection, which he first described, into different species. Some species go extinct over time, so this is time from the past to the present. Other species continue on, may branch into new species, and then those species go extinct. Some make it all the way to modern day. The top of the tree is modern day, and that's what we see today in modern day. And you would interpret this as because these two species, A and F, had a common ancestor in the fairly recent past, then they are more closely related to each other via that common ancestor than either one is to M over here, which split off from a common ancestor much longer ago. So this idea of a phylogenetic tree to describe how organisms are related to each other, the organisms we see today. You can see all kinds of different forms of this tree. These up here are fairly simple. They can be drawn so that the species are drawn on the right-hand side of the page, and time goes from left to right, or from top to bottom, and they can be drawn with angles instead of straight lines. When you get into more complicated branches, or complicated trees, they do some other graphic tricks just to try to fit everybody on the page, like this one, just trying to fit everybody on the page in one figure. They draw it as in circular shape, but the idea is pretty much the same. This one is a little bit different in that it doesn't have a root. The root of this tree, of all these trees, is the common ancestor of all these species. Okay, the root of this tree is the common ancestor of all these species. This one doesn't have a root. Okay, so if we are looking at trees and interpreting trees, there's some vocabulary about phylogenetic trees that's helpful to know. As I mentioned, the root of the tree, if you think of a tree in your yard, it has a root, and that's where the tree begins. This is where this tree of life begins. There was some common ancestor that gave rise to all of the extant species or taxa. It's not necessarily species. It can be a bigger group than species, like all fish, for example. Those taxa, or way of grouping organisms, are listed here, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different taxa that we see in present day. Extant means still living, and they all had a common ancestor. At some point in their history, they had a population that branched into two different populations, and that is called a node. So this is a node, that's a node, that's a node, and so on. Okay, and this goes from present time here, where you see the taxa, to sometime in the distant past. When you're looking at these trees, how to interpret these trees is that B and C are more closely related to each other than either one is to A. A, B, and C are more closely related to any of the D, E, F, G, or H species. D through H are more closely related to each other than they are to A, B, and C. Again, E and F more closely related to each other than either one is to D, and so on. And then E and F more closely related to G and H than they are to D, because their common ancestor species at this node is sooner, not as distant in time as the node that branched off D. So these four are more closely related to each other than any of them are to D. Okay, another important thing about looking at these nodes is that, or these trees, is that every node on here, 1, 2 through 7, is on a swivel. So if I said A, C, B instead of A, B, C, it would be the same tree. Right to left does not matter within a node. So if I mix up the order of E and F or G and H, does not matter. And if I put D, E, F, G over here and A, B, C over here, also doesn't matter. It doesn't change how you interpret the tree. So let's say I asked you to draw a phylogenetic tree for a very simple relationship. How are cats, humans, and goldfish related to each other? First thing you do is you join the two things in the tree that are more closely related to each other than the third thing. So cats and humans are more closely related to each other than either one is to goldfish. G. Okay. And then give the tree a root. So as I would say, this is that there was a common ancestor of all these vertebrate species, things with a backbone, that there was a population that split off. On one of those branches gave rise to fish, and another branch gave rise to mammals, and two examples of mammals within the mammal group are cats and humans. That's how I'd interpret that tree. So when people are drawing trees, they tend to make common mistakes. So make sure that your tree has a root. And don't do the add-on branch. This is something I see people doing all the time. So let's say I did have a root, but then, and we got the cats and the humans on there, they don't know quite what to do with the goldfish, and so they do this sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to draw a big X through this so you make sure that you don't do that. How I would interpret this is that sometime in the evolution history of humans, there was a population that split off and made goldfish, and that doesn't make any sense. So you don't want to add the side branch thing in there. Is you want to make sure that you stay true to how we think these things evolved, and remember that this axis here, this vertical axis, if I'm drawing a tree this way, is time. Okay. You want to pay attention to branch length. So sometimes people will shorten up their branches because they want the ends of the words to come out even. So like if I was trying to write humans here, trying to write with a mouse. And then if I was trying to write goldfish here, etc., you get the idea. And I wanted the ends of the words to come out even, then the branches aren't, put a root on my tree, the branches aren't even. And that's not how you want to draw it, because the tip of the branch means that's where that organism died out. So in this tree, it would say that cats are still alive today, but humans aren't. They died sometime in our past, and so did goldfish, died some in our past. So you want to make sure all of those branch, oops, oh, there goes my drawings. You want to make sure all those branch links come right up to the surface, like that, and then put your labels on here: cat, human, goldfish. Okay. This would say that all three of these species are extant, present in present day, and they had the cats and the humans had a common ancestor sometime in our geological history, and had a common ancestor with goldfish sometimes further in our geological history, our evolutionary history. And that's how we understand that relationship. Okay, so don't do the add-on branch thing. Make sure your tree's got a root, and make sure all of the branch links come up to the top. Okay, and I will likely ask you to draw a tree on a test, and it's going to be a simple tree, just 3 or 4 taxa in there, and it should be, I'm going to give you organisms that you're familiar with and that you should know the evolutionary history of. So here, in case you don't know, here is a tree of vertebrates from the Berkeley site that shows you how they're related to each other. So in this tree, there was a common ancestor of all vertebrates. Soon after, sharks branched off, and they continued modern day. And then there was another branch point here, another node here, where you get a split between ray fin fishes. These are bony fishes. Sharks don't have a bony skeleton. They have a cartilage skeleton. And then that split with what gave rise to everything else, amphibians, primates, and so on. Primates are more closely related to rodents, for example, and crocodiles are more closely related to birds, for example, than either one is to each other. So primates are not that closely related to crocodiles. They're more closely related to rodents, and crocodiles are more closely related to birds than a bird would be to a rabbit, for example. Okay, so you should know this tree. All right. So back to Darwin's tree, where he's talking about the original cell. Okay. And what were the original cells, and how are they represented in cells that we see today? Well, we've talked about prokaryotes and eukaryotes a bit in this class, but we really haven't talked about what the characteristics are of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, other than a mention of the shape of their DNA chromosome and that sort of thing. Commonly, it will be said that prokaryotes don't have any membrane-bound organelles, and that is true, but it's not to say that they don't have internal membranes. So your book tries to make this distinction here, that this is a misconception. You do have some prokaryotes that have taken their outer membrane, it is folded in, and sometimes folded in pretty dramatically, and they actually do reactions on them. So if this is from a bacterium that has an internal folded membrane, that internal folded membrane is holding the enzymes to do photosynthesis, and that is very similar to what we would consider an organelle, and a plant, a chloroplast, that has internal membranes to do photosynthesis. A distinction is this is connected with the outer membrane, and other organelles true organelles in eukaryotes, there is no connection to the outer membrane. Your book is saying that's a pretty lame distinction, but it is a distinction that is different between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So in general, what's different between prokaryotes and eukaryotes? There's not like a great figure that I found in your book, so I looked on the web, and this one comes with Dora the Explorer, so that's cool. Okay, there are 3 domains of life that we agree on now. When I was talking yesterday, in a previous podcast, about phylogeny and what makes a species and what doesn't make a species, and I said a lot has changed as we got new information. When I took this class, there was only 2 domains of life, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now within prokaryotes, there are 2 domains, the archaeans and the bacteria. They are both single-celled organisms. Eukaryotes can be single-celled or multicellular. But there are some real differences between archaeans and bacteria. Archaeans are not just types of bacteria, they're really different. But all prokaryotes, the DNA is so-called naked in that it doesn't have protein bound to it, and protein that is winding up the DNA to make it fit in a small space. In all prokaryotes, the DNA is circular. There's some archaeans actually where that might not be true, but we're going to say that because Dora says so for this class. The DNA is linear in chromosomes, like you saw in mitosis and meiosis. In eukaryotes, usually DNA does not have introns in prokaryotes and usually does in eukaryotes, but there are some, again, archaeans where that's an exception. There is no true nucleus in an archaean in that the DNA is not wrapped up in a membrane envelope, several layers of membrane, and it is in all eukaryotes. The organelles are not membrane bound in a prokaryote. So that was the point I was just talking about. There are prokaryotes that have internally folded membrane. That membrane is connected to the outside membrane, but it's not independent. And it doesn't have independent organelles with specialized function that divide separate from the rest of the cell. Whereas eukaryotes have all that stuff. They have membrane-bound organelles with specialized functions, and those organelles can divide even though the cell's not going to divide. The shape and the RNA composition, not the shape so much as the size of the RNA that makes up ribosomal RNA is different in archaeans and bacteria than it is in eukaryotes. Bacteria divide by the cell splitting in half, similar to mitosis, but it's not the same sort of deal. We didn't go over binary fission, but it is different than mitosis. Cells divide by mitosis and meiosis in eukaryotes. There's 1 chromosome per cell in prokaryotes, where there can be lots of chromosomes in eukaryotes per cell. And on average, prokaryotes are smaller than eukaryotes, even single-celled eukaryotes. Okay, well, so 3 domains of life. Eukaryotes, humans are in this domain. Archaeans and eukaryotes, I'm sorry, eubacteria, I read that wrong. So bacteria, eu means true. True bacteria, archaeans, which are not bacteria, but sort of look like bacteria and have some similar properties. These 2 domains of life are the prokaryotes, And then this domain of life over here is the eukaryotes, and the eukaryotes include humans and most of what you consider organisms that you see in your life. All the grass that you see, all the trees that you see, your dog, your cat, all that stuff, all those are eukaryotes. So if we're trying to figure out, what was the ancestor, was it closer to a eubacterium, or was it closer to an archaean, this root of the tree? We think it's probably not a eukaryote, but which of these were closest to the root, and which of these are closest to us? Now it shows that archaeans are closest to us on here, but how do we get that idea? So if we look at the DNA sequence of different genes that control things that all cells do. So all cells translate proteins, all cells transcribe DNA from our DNA into mRNA, and if we look at the genes that control that in eukaryotes, they are most closely related to genes from archaeans that do that same job versus genes from bacteria that do that job. But if we look at energy harvesting enzymes, we'll talk about some of these later on in the class, they look more like bacterial enzymes. They are closer in a phylogenetic tree to bacterial sequences than they are to archaean sequences. And then some aspects of cell signaling, we'll talk about this a bit later. Cell signaling is sort of like you release a hormone and that causes cells to change what genes they transcribe. Cell signaling also is like you activate a neuron and your muscle twitches, that sort of thing. A lot of those genes look like archaean genes, but if you look at the genes that make up the cytoskeleton, sort of the rigid structure, rigid but flexible structure of a cell, microtubules are part of the cytoskeleton, the things that pull the chromosomes through the cell during mitosis and meiosis. Those genes look more like bacterial genes. So that if we put it all together, again, these are functions that all cells do. All cells translate protein, all cells transcribe DNA, all cells can convert energy from one form to another, all cells do some kind of signaling, all cells have some form of cytoskeleton, and it's a mix in that some of these genes look like archaean genes and some of these genes look like bacterial genes. So how do you figure it out? So if we look at the ancestor of all species on Earth, and then there's a split between bacteria and archaea. One hypothesis now is that there was a fusion that took part of the characteristics of archaeans and part of the characteristics of bacteria and led to what we know as eukaryotes, because in eukaryotes we have genes that look like archaean genes and genes that look like bacterial genes. So this is not a Darwin sort of tree, and it's a new sort of tree, and there is some evidence that this sort of thing can happen, and we'll talk more about this in future podcasts. So if I take a eukaryotic cell, okay, it has, so there's the outside cell membrane. It has membranes on the inside of the cell. There are parts of that cell that look like they are most closely related to archaeans. So cell cycle control, when to divide, when to go through mitosis, how the nucleus is organized. There's an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum that makes a lot of protein. These little dots on here are ribosomes, are on that. That looks like more archaeans. How the DNA is organized looks more archaean, and how translation happens looks more archaean. But if we look at other parts of the cell, like the mitochondria, the so-called powerhouse of the cell. We'll talk lots about these in the coming weeks. They look more like bacteria. So eukaryotes may be a mixture of both. So maybe this kind of a tree, and this doesn't quite fit with Darwin's tree, but Darwin still had the idea to draw hypotheses about how organisms are related to each other using a tree sort of diagram, and that was super influential. And you'll still see trees all over the place in biological discussions about how things are related to each other.